Hello and welcome. Today we're going to have a closer look at the brand new defaulting feature that we've added to Advanced Requisition Management in version 10.3.6, and this tutorial is going to briefly run through how the concept works. Now, defaulting is going to enable an ARM user to modify multiple lines of their requisition all at one time in bulk with very few clicks and with a minimum of fuss. Now, of course, we know that it's already relatively simple to change the details of a requisition line in ARM anyway, provided the user has the necessary authority to do so. However, it can become rather time-consuming having to do this manually, line by line, especially when we're dealing with requisitions that consist of many lines. This, of course, is where the defaulting feature is going to come in handy. So let's dive into our ARM environment now and see how this concept works in practice. So I'm currently logged in as Maurice, and I'm firstly going to recall a requisition that I've created earlier. And what you should be able to see is that this requisition consists currently of 8 lines. You can also see that these lines are destined for multiple vendors. We have various receiving locations to consider, and we have a multitude of different GL account codes that are being affected, and so forth. So it's quite a varied requisition. Let's assume now that we want to have this entire requisition attributed to a single specific GL account code. The traditional approach would be to open and edit each requisition line separately and then resave them. But of course, this isn't going to be very efficient in this case because we're dealing with a number of lines and we'd need to manually apply this process to each line. So instead, we now click the new defaults button, which you can see here. Now, when I click on this button, we now see a drop-down list showing a range of criteria which we can now default across the entire requisition. You'll notice that some of these fields are already checked and activated based on some pre-configured criteria within ARM. For example, the GL account code has the middle segment defaulting to 00. It's doing this because I have ARM configured that way for all of Maurice's requisitions. It's actually part of his user account setup. But anyway, at this point, what we can do is we can go through and populate any information that we wish to have default across the requisition. So I'm in the GL account code column here. I'm just going to change this to 12150000. Now note that I can toggle all of these defaults on or off using the using the toggle selection button. But now, once we've entered this account value, let's apply the selected fields to our lines. So I click the orange button. It will prompt me to confirm my choice. And now when you have a look at the GL account code column, you should see that for each line, it has now defaulted to the 12150000 account code that we entered in the defaulting header. But that's not the only thing. We also may have noticed that the receiving location was checked to default as well. So in addition to the GL account, we should also be able to see that the receiving locations have now also all defaulted to the CHI location. Now, what if you didn't want to default every single line? Let's say you wanted to update the bulk of your requisition, but you also wanted to lock specific requisition lines so that they don't default. Well, that's certainly possible too. Excuse me. So you might have noticed that we've also introduced a little pin icon next to each requisition line. And what we can do here is we can activate or engage these pins to bypass the defaulting process for those lines. So let's look at another example now. I've pinned the top 3 lines, but I'm going to go back up to my defaulting header and I'm going to default the remaining lines back to a single vendor. And in this case, let's use IT experts. So in the vendor column, or in the vendor field rather, I populate the value, it checks that box. And now when I apply these selected fields, we should notice that all of the vendors will now default with the exception of the top 3 lines which have been locked. So I click apply, I once again get my confirmation. And now we can see that as expected, all of the vendors have defaulted with the exception of the top 3 lines, which once again we have pinned or locked. And in this case, the defaulting procedure bypasses those lines. Now, once all of your defaulting has been applied and the requisition has been completed, the next step, of course, would be to submit the requisition for approval as normal. So this is typical process for ARM workflow at this point. So hopefully you can see that by having this ability to mass edit requisition lines using our defaulting feature, particularly where we're dealing with requisitions that consist of many different lines, we get a huge efficiency boost. We save ourselves a lot of time and obviously a lot of manual editing.